A microaggression was a term that was coined in the 1970s by this gentleman here, Chester Pierce. He was a actually well-known psychiatrist from Harvard. He played on their football team, was a pretty famous fella, and a very, very well-known psychiatrist, actually. He had a tremendous legacy also in civil rights. But the idea that he had was that the day-to-day grind of prejudiced comments and the little slights that a person of color would experience pretty much on a daily basis were actually quite problematic. We'll talk about the effects of microaggressions as we go along, but a fairly short definition would be, as I've written here, these everyday slights, insults, slips of the tongue, not being seen in line, those kinds of things that are generally unconscious. Sometimes they're conscious and maybe even well-intentioned, but the effect is that they communicate hostility and some kind of devaluing of who you are or who someone else is. A great deal of the microaggression literature is around racial microaggressions, and that's generally what I'll talk about today. But these are obviously applicable to any minoritized group. I must say, as a woman, we're experienced to microaggressions on a daily basis, but are socialized to think that they're kind of cool, or maybe they mean we're desirable, when in fact they're actually very demeaning in a lot of ways. Microaggressions definitely arise from individual bias, but they in turn have their roots in our culture at large, in our political systems, in our institutions. And even though they are seemingly benign or, not that bad, they are in fact part of the ongoing oppression of any minoritized group. To qualify as a microaggression, though, they don't necessarily rise to the level of being an overt, racist, or certainly violent kind of event, but they can be just shy of it. And they are also deeply, deeply wounding in their possible effects, almost stunning at times, shocking. Earlier literature looked at microaggressions from a physical medicine perspective, and the effects of microaggressions were sometimes discussed under the heading of something called John Henryism. Normally, I'm in a room of younger people who don't know who John Henry is. If we need to talk about that at the end of the talk, I'm sure there'll be plenty of time. In fact, normally when I speak, it's in person and I encourage dialogue, but in this particular format, it might be a little more difficult. At any rate, if you want to know who John Henry was, I could tell you about that later. But it refers to the idea that there's a very strong, usually cardiovascular damage that's incurred by the constant struggle to try to prove yourself or to try to push against endemic racism. It was quite noticeable, especially in cardiology, where men and women, most of the research, of course, was based on men. They had tremendously high levels of cardiovascular damage, which affected their quality of life and actually ended their lives a good decade or so before their expected life expectancy. And it was they attributed this quite accurately due to constantly being under the pressure of racism, whether it was openly hostile or whether it was just this subtle day-to-day grind of these little cuts, these little nicks, these little slights, these annoying comments. They're also very hard to cope with, not just because they're everywhere and every day, but they're kind of ambiguous, which gives it makes it harder to cope with them. If they were open, if they were undoubtedly an attack upon you, you could rally your resources and either decide to defend against them in some way, or to support yourself in some way against that occurrence. But ambiguity is actually an important aspect of microaggression that makes them hard to cope with, hard to manage, hard to deal with openly. Should have switched to another slide here. There we go. So I'll talk about ambiguity as a little side trip here. The ambiguity might be in the situation. The ambiguity might be in the fact that generally this person doesn't seem to be racist or sexist or ableist, but they somehow say something or do something that conveys clear prejudice. The perpetrator of the microaggression might in fact not have any, at least conscious desire to be harmful or insulting, but they are nonetheless. The ambiguity arises also because you, as the receiver of the microaggression, or perhaps as the perpetrator of the microaggression, can also rationalize it, minimize its intent, minimize its effect. The ambiguity also arises out of the fact that all of us, even those of us who are working really hard every day to not be racist, to not be sexist, all those sorts of things, we cannot nonetheless get away from the way our brain works and the fact that we always sort of have this in-group, out-group thinking going on. That's our primitive, I'll call it limbic thinking, that allows us to constantly be deciding whether someone is familiar, whether someone is safe, whether they are like us. That thinking is automatically built into our thought processes. We can overcome that to some degree, but it's ever present. I don't know that we'll ever be able to not have that happen. Another huge source of the ambiguity is the fact that you, as the receiver or the target of the remark or the slights or the being not seen, might question yourself. You go, well, gee, am I being sensitive? Am I having an off day? Did they really mean what they said? Were they really aware of how hurtful that could have been? So the receiver also can doubt and rationalize and minimize as well. It's also very difficult, and we'll talk about this some more as well, but might as well start the conversation here. It's really difficult to rally a useful response in the moment. It's tough to say, well, wow, what did you just say? Did you really mean what you just said? Do you realize that you just cut in front of that old lady in line? It's very tough to not have that conversation go well, or to even have that conversation start. Even if you ask a question like, what did you just say? That may actually end the conversation. The only so-called advantage that might accrue about around this ambiguity is that people of minoritized groups tend to grow up to be quite sensitive to social cues. And I want to bring this up now, and I'll probably, or hopefully will repeat it again. This sensitivity has been sometimes exaggerated by frequently the white minority of academicians and just the white culture at large, saying things like, oh, you're just too sensitive. That was then, this is now. Just get over it. So and that's actually showed up in the professional academic literature. As a retort, other researchers have looked into this, and they have discovered, not surprisingly, that members of minoritized groups are in fact not hypersensitive. They are just sensitive enough. In fact, they're as sensitive as anybody else. What's different is that they are constantly bombarded by evidence of endemic racism through overt and more covert kinds of aggressions, such as microaggressions. So again, minoritized groups are not hypersensitive. They're just hammered all the time. I'm going to take a look at the chat here, see if there's, yes, I was going to mention this. Thank you, Deb. Let's get back to microaggressions. The new, the originator of this concept is Dr. Pierce. The new hero in microaggression research, the microaggression trainings that you can get in corporations and other places is Daryl Wing Su. Dr. Su is well known as one of the co-founders of very powerful multicultural psychology, along with Dr. White and many other members in the usually around the 70s or so. Again, one of the founders of multicultural psych. One of his big areas of expertise is microaggressions. In fact, behind him on the, I just realized as I can see it in larger print, that's a poem, Still I Rise, from Dr. Angelou, which he uses a lot in a description of what microaggressions do to people, yet how those people can also remain resilient. One of the things that Dr. Su has done in true psychological fashion is he's made a typology of microaggressions. You don't need to make, that chart is not as important as the side comments here. And this model has changed a little bit, but he's taken a look at, he and fellow researchers have taken a look at the kinds of things that qualify as microaggressions. They include the micro insult. These are little jibes, insensitive remarks. Sometimes they're not actually jibes. They may not have been intended to be hurtful, but they are. They are remarks that people make that are insensitive, possibly rude or crude, based on the assumption of someone's membership in a particular group. They're often sexist remarks. They are often remarks about intelligence, remarks about, again, being hypersensitive. There might be something about their moral character. That's considered a micro insult. Very commonly, and these are even harder to deal with in some ways, are also micro invalidations. These are actions and comments that basically erase your presence in the room. They deny or minimize your experience as a minoritized member of the society. And certain good examples of this are things like the myth of meritocracy in the United States, or anywhere for that matter. And of saying, oh, yeah, color's not something that I notice. It's not important to me. I don't see color. That's actually a denial of some very, very, very profound realities. The denial, of course, of one's own racism is a micro-invalidation. The result of being invalidated, of course, is of feeling unworthy, of being unseen, of being invisible in the room, and generally alienated from the people around you. Now, even though his initial model included something that he calls a micro assault, I don't know if he's actually removed this from later models, but I think it ought to be, because I would say that's more in the macro aggression. It is a more conscious, more deliberate remark or comment or action that is deliberately designed to hurt another person. To me, that takes it out of the micro and into the macro realm. Some examples. This is where, again, if I was in a classroom or if we were speaking live, we would have, at least 20 minutes worth of examples that just sort of pour out of everybody. But one thing I'd like to do is just go through a couple of examples. And one of them is from a really excellent book by Claudia Rankine. So let me pause here for a sec. Anybody interested in getting any of the references? It's a very small list of references, but I could have given you, take it back, I could have given you many pages of references. I need to go back 2 slides here. But instead, I got it down to 1 page and then a page of websites. And anybody interested in that can have that emailed to them at the end of the presentation. But one of the books in that is called Citizen. And it's by Claudia Rankine, an American poet laureate, African-American woman, lives out, I think, in Pomona at this point. She's a California gal, at least now she is. And she speaks quite profoundly and about these experiences of microaggressions. And one of these is a remark that was intended to be funny, but again, was quite stunning. And I'm going to read it directly from the book. It's very short. She's a poet, but this book, Citizen, is mostly in prose format, although she's still a very poetic writer. So here's a memory that she has. The book, quite a bit of it is about her reveries of what it's been like to live as an African-American woman in American culture. So here's a memory. You are rushing to meet a friend in a distant neighborhood of Santa Monica. Again, she's coming from Pomona to do this. This friend says, as you walk toward her, you are late, you nappy-headed hoe. What did you say? You ask, though you have heard every word. What did you say? This person has never before referred to you like this in your presence. Never before code switched in this manner. What did you say? She doesn't, perhaps physically cannot, repeat what she has just said. So that's an example of a microaggression. On the face of it, doesn't seem very micro, eh? It seems very harmful. Oftentimes people will extend so-called compliments. You're not like them. You're not one of them, right? You're a credit to, fill in the blank. You're a credit to your tribe. You're a credit to your gender, whatever. These are intended supposedly as compliments, but they're extraordinarily insulting. A friend of mine told me this story. She's another professor who I met at Chicago School, where I've also met Dr. Warner. She and her husband were looking for an apartment. She called around, had a had a showing scheduled. She gets to the showing, and the real estate agent starts to stammer. He says, "Oh, you didn't sound," and he stops himself. He means to say, "You didn't sound black on the phone." And he then manages to fill in the rest of his stammering by saying, sorry, but I don't have any more rental applications. She, of course, knows the score. She decides not to press it because she's tired of pressing it, frankly. And as she walks by the real estate agent's car, of course, he has a whole box of rental applications on his backseat. That's a microaggression. Hardly micro in its effects at the moment, or in its potential effects long-term. Other forms of microaggression that are not necessarily talked about in the typology I just showed you, but are things like cultural appropriation, without the appreciation or acknowledgement of where these things came from. And this is a long tradition in American and other colonist countries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but possibly the most dangerous aspect of microaggressions is that they become internalized. We begin to own them. We can't help but soak in what has been in our social environment. And we begin to take on and perhaps believe what other people have said about us or implied about us, which is unfortunate. Just before we talk, I want to make a slight reminder of the difference between a microaggression and a macroaggression. Quite a bit of what I'm going to say later about what we do about microaggressions are actually applicable to working against the larger macroaggressive world. But again, I would like to make this distinction here. A microaggression resides in an individual's bias and attitudes, and it is in turn directed towards another individual. So it's a microcosm of the larger world's prejudice and bias. And that's where macroaggressions are. They reside in programs, policies, traditions, the history of a culture at large and institutions within that culture. And they are directed towards whole large groups of people. Those people tend at times to be marginalized. I shouldn't say marginalized, or excuse me, at times marginalized. They are always marginalized, but in subtle ways sometimes. So for instance, women and children are marginalized, although you'd have to sort of think a little bit about that before you realized, yeah, they are marginalized, aren't they? So sometimes the marginalization is subtle, sometimes it's quite noticeable. So again, micro is kind of more this one-on-one microcosm, essentially, of prejudice at large. And the reason that distinction might be important is because as difficult as it is to deal with microaggressions, which is one-on-one, it's even more difficult and overwhelming at times to deal with macroaggressions, unless you're in a crowd. So in about the last 5-10 years, there's actually been some really, really good work developed around micro interventions. And there are many barriers to micro interventions. In other words, barriers to really effectively dealing with and changing and having meaningful conversations and interactions about microaggressions. There's a lot of barriers to them. In some ways, trying to become activated and deal with a microaggression is a type of, or you're dealing with a type of bystander effect, even if you're a target. It's kind of like, what do I do now? What do I do now that would be useful? Do I want to take this on? Is it worth the trouble? Do I need to pick a different battle? But it's essentially overcoming the bystander effect in a lot of ways. So some of the internal battles, especially if you're a bystander, an ally, not necessarily constantly subjected to microaggressions yourself, is that you may not know enough about the many internal and external systems that go into microaggressions. You may need to have more knowledge, more education. There is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a certain amount of ambiguity and uncertainty about the microaggression situation itself. Probably the toughest one is the fact that both as an ally or a bystander, but especially as a target, there's a lot of negative emotions. Maybe you've been stuffing those emotions down and storing them up for decades, and they will come up. They will arise in the moment. And how do you deal with all of that and still try to act effectively? That's really difficult. Lots and lots of external barriers, of course. They are all in our culture. And the ones that have been looked at the most are around racial microaggressions, and particularly what will happen if you try to challenge a racial microaggression is that you will quickly encounter white rage and white sensitivity or white vulnerability, white fragility. And that then all of a sudden becomes the priority and completely takes away from the opportunity to have a real conversation about a racial microaggression. There's often scenes discussed in which, for instance, a classroom discussion will occur. Some of the people of color in the room begin to become more honest about what goes on. And then one of the white girls starts to cry. and that's it, discussion over. Because what's more important in the room is that you've upset a nice little white girl. Clearly, any kind of ism, not just racism, but sexism, anti-LGBT, anti-ethnic prejudices, language of origin, culture of origin, all of that kind of stuff is embedded in dominant culture narratives about the goodness of the dominant culture and narratives about the badness or the hypersensitivity of the peoples that we tend to marginalize. All of these things, all of these external things tend to very quickly move into blaming the victim. And again, of course, this remark about people of minoritized cultures being too sensitive has been frequently debunked by lots and lots of research. Even though it is difficult to intervene, especially to intervene effectively and not either have the conversation die on the vine or to escalate the situation, the cost of not intervening is very high. This is essentially the cost of any kind of microaggression. And that is that there's especially if you are the target of these aggressions, microaggressions, if you at some point don't begin to somehow move against them, you feel a loss of integrity. You feel like maybe you're betraying yourself. You become almost willing to believe what other people say just because you're no longer your true self. In fact, you may actually find it difficult to develop a true sense of felt integrity because of the onslaught of these negative remarks about yourself. You can feel paralyzed, overwhelmed, confused, certainly eventually hopeless. Whether you actively take on what has been said to you or about you, you're still going to start having that seep into your sense of who you are, your sense of reality, your assumptions about how the world works. You may develop a sense of shame and guilt, as anybody who is minoritized and traumatized will. And I'll have, you could spend another hour at least on this last one, which is that there is a multitude of stress-related effects throughout your entire biology and psychology, affecting your brain, your cardiovascular system, your immunological system, your stress response system, your gut, your stomach, and its microbiome. That's the cost of not doing something about it. Similar things occur even if you are not a direct target, but you are an ally or bystander. You could feel like you're not living up to your own standards, like you're betraying yourself or people you care about, or groups of people that you want to defend and be allied with. By not acting, you're perpetuating the system. You're becoming part of the problem, not part of the solution. Eventually, you can also develop the sense of being overwhelmed and helpless and not feeling empowered or enabled to do something about it. You may want to just not want to rock the boat. That's not okay anymore. I think that we're seeing that enough is enough, and it is really time. It's actually a very good time. It's a very ripe time to decide to take up the mantle and actually intervene. By not intervening, also you might also not only be betraying, but actually be seen by the very people that you would like to defend as not really being there for them. And eventually you can also fall into regret, self-condemnation, etc. This, by the way, there's hardly anything that I'm saying in this PowerPoint, in this discussion, that is not backed by some kind of research. Costs continued cost of not intervening, it actually costs perpetrators, just like bullies and bullying. Allowing bullying to go on is very bad for the targets, but it's also very bad for the person that does the bullying. It allows them to maintain a level of personal development that is not very high. It allows them to maintain distorted ideas of how the world works. They also can develop eventually fear and avoidance of the people that they denigrate, possibly at times with some, legitimacy to be fearful. But you're disconnecting from your own humanity to be allowed to constantly attack other groups of people. And obviously there's a cost to at least your immediate social circle and the society at large. We'll stick with the smaller social circle, say your workplace, your school, your colleagues. You're going to be stuck in this perpetual prejudice machine unless you begin to intervene. Again, without intervening, you become or capitulate to the status quo and are no longer part of the solution. You are now a part of the problem. If you begin to wake up a little bit and you can see that you might be able to do things and you choose not to, that gets to be problematic. I mentioned something here at the bottom, mezzo level. There's ongoing discussions now. There's microaggressions and micro interventions. There's macroaggressions and macro interventions, but there's also at the meso level between micro and macro, and that would refer mostly to your immediate, slightly larger social circle. Again, where you work, worship, attend school, socialize, etc. So interventions and aggressions that occur in that sphere will often be referred to as mezzo. You may see that increasingly in the literature. Non-action will precipitate the ongoing mental and physical health of health problems that go with aggression. And given that this was a leadership-based conference, leadership requires that we intervene, even if it's on the micro level. This is personal leadership. Leadership, to my mind, frequently begins with an inner journey, an inner development, an inner commitment to certain values. So it may begin with self-reflection and education before you can actually competently act. Don't decide one day that you're going to go out there and fix it. You'll just make a mess out of it. Self-identity, one more time, self-awareness and identifying your own biases is really crucial. We all have biases. Our brain is designed to have biases. It's always got its own particular unique perspective with likes and dislikes and preferences and non-preferences. So biases we can't get rid of, but we can not turn biases into something that's harmful or something that is rude or unkind. It doesn't matter if I prefer strawberry. It doesn't ruin the rest of the world if I prefer strawberry, and I shouldn't dislike anybody who prefers vanilla, right? Likes and biases are very different from using those preferences to then demean and be cruel to people who don't share my preferences or my comfort zone. It's also not just an intellectual exercise. Reading about it, philosophizing about it, talking about it is not enough. It really is a life practice. And the earlier it starts, the better, because as we know, sadly, the older we get, certainly by just by our 30s, certainly by our 40s and 50s, any explicit biases that we have had have now gone underground and have become implicit in order to access. Another thing to keep in mind is that endless amounts of research has indicated that any kind of active coping around anything, especially trauma, results in much better mental and physical health outcomes. So again, not doing something is maybe an untenable position, at least trying to be new, trying to be Switzerland. Switzerland can't even be Switzerland. You can't not do something once you become aware, and it will almost always result in better outcomes. Ideally, and this is where some new work has come out that's very helpful. Ideally, we now have ways of teaching people how to effectively and usefully and safely intervene when a microaggression occurs. So skillful microinterventions will involve everyday small actions taken by anybody who wants to, whether you're a target, a bystander, an onlooker, a parent, an ally, anybody. But to do so, you have to be mindful, maybe you've practiced a little bit, maybe you've learned a few things, and mostly you have to watch your own level of emotional intensity. But they're the everyday small actions that you can take to make a difference when a microaggression occurs. This is still very much in the Daryl Wing Sue camp. They have talked about three main types, so I'll go over those at least briefly. They're microaffirmations, microprotections, and microchallenges. Microaffirmations, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, easy to do, can be very subtle. These are very small acts that validate somebody in the room who has just been microaggressed, okay? It can be a simple eye contact, it can be a simple nod, it can be something really subtle. The idea is that by that action, by that word, you have acknowledged the presence and worth and perhaps pain of somebody in the room who's been microaggressed. It can be a compliment. It can be some way that indicates support or affirmation. And the main thing it does is it validates the presence, the value, and the experience that that person has just had in the room. It is designed to be a counterbalance to feeling the inequities in the room. Now, later on, you can also have a private conversation with them, take them out for lunch and hang out with them. But in the moment, it can be very small, very subtle. I think that probably everybody at this conference has experienced that at some time. The relief, the appreciation for simply being acknowledged, and perhaps even more importantly, having your experience of pain being acknowledged, without having to even be particularly overt about it. That would be a micro-confrontation. Micro-protections are hugely important. Most of the research on this is based around youth, but it doesn't have to be youth. It can be anybody of any age that is having to struggle with ongoing microaggressions, prejudice, etc. Generally, though, the research is around youth. And the idea here is that you are helping people, probably based in part on your own experience, to cope with, understand, and be able to manage the reality that they are in a world that might not receive them well all of the time. It is training in, it's helping people develop a comfortable cultural or multicultural identity as a gay person, identity as a disabled person, identity as an immigrant to the country that is accurately prideful, and allows them to also understand, though, that you have very good reason to be proud of who you are, but you are in a world that does not always appreciate that. So here's how you defend yourself against this. And it often involves, lessons around history, lessons around how to manage anxiety in the presence of police officers. That's the talk, that's part of a micro protection. It may be around how to manage the welling up of powerful emotions so that they become manageable. But mostly it's about developing a solid sense of identity and pride, and possibly also creating safe spaces, or what used to be also called counter spaces, where people can just relax and be themselves and feel the company of similar others and allies. A lot of civil rights movements, pride movements, etc., essentially fit into this category of microprotections. There's my mouse. The last of the micro interventions are called micro challenges. And I'll go to the last bit on this. There is a challenge in using micro challenges. You have to have very good affect regulation in order to do this. If you're going to challenge someone openly, it really does have to be from a mindset of calm, possibly neutral curiosity, and not that, like that's what brings out me immediately. I'm a very reactive, intense person, and I have to kind of go into my Zen place before I can do any of this. So that's difficult. That's one of the difficulties with it. That's why some training and practice and having a support group around this is very useful. But a challenge is more direct. The challenge, the affirmations and the protections are more designed to focus on the target of a microaggression. These are designed to deal with the perpetrator of the microaggression. It's not the community or the target of them. Again, it's the source of them, which is difficult to do in a way that is effective, that's not going to escalate the situation. The idea is to neutralize or disarm the situation while also trying to educate the person that has committed the microaggression, to help them to see that that might be hurtful or harmful, regardless of what their good intentions may have been. There's some simple ways to do this that are also really brief without having a big, long conversation, but maybe it opens up to a conversation later. That can include showing your disagreement or disapproval of what has just been said or is in the process of being said, by interrupting the telling of a sexist, ableist, anti-gay, racist kinds of jokes, conveying general disapproval, not in a cross and demeaning way, because that only provokes more hostility, but to do so in calm, matter-of-fact fashion. It's actually surprisingly easy to do once you've done it a few times. You can point out a discriminatory behavior just with a simple comment. You can, if somebody says something that sounds off base, that there's prejudice behind it, you can say, well, I'm not sure what you mean by that. Could you explain that a little bit more? That works really well because it allows the person who's been talking to continue talking and they don't feel so cut off. Chief among these can be really helpful. It's a little bit like a micro affirmation, is to support the perspective of the target, support the perspective of the minoritized person to whom again the remark has been directed. So those are micro challenges, and again, the challenge there is to do so in a way that does not escalate. So you have to be pretty solid in your own commitment to being anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-whatever, anti-prejudiced, in order to pull this off. There's meso interventions, and they frequently are used in schools that show fairly good success rates, actually, including creating safe counter spaces, developing training programs for faculty, staff, and students around anti-bias. Try to make your curriculum as multicultural as possible. Very interesting and easy to do, especially. It's actually easy to do in college. Every time I teach a college class, I try to make it as multicultural as possible, even if it's stats, have people come out of their cultural bubbles. Macro interventions, same kinds of things, but at a much larger level. If you're comfortable with dealing with microaggressions, you'll be gangbusters on macro interventions. Macro interventions also occur usually with the support of, civil rights groups, attorneys, movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. So that's part of a lot of the discussions on micro interventions. They very quickly morph into macro. I wanted to just add one last thing. I will actually, unless Debra would prefer that I not, we could leave some room open for some discussion. I've got one more slide. I also want to plug a couple of things that we're going to be doing with this course, but a reminder that micro interventions can be hard work. You can burn out easily. You can feel alone. You could become the target of you have microaggressions yourself once you begin to do this work. So please seek a like-minded community. Script is a great community. The people that run this are very knowledgeable, very open people that welcome questions and consultation. And they're up for starting up something new in the 2 seconds of spare time they have every week. You got to find other people to help you. You may need to go into therapy or somehow deal with your own trauma, your own upset around these issues. Definitely find, though, support groups, like-minded folks, buddy systems. You'll also probably likely have to continue your own self-exploration journey, whether that is psychological, spiritual, however you frame that, because you will be surprised when you start stirring around in there what some of your own biases and prejudices are. You might not have even been aware of them, including being biased and prejudiced against people who are biased and prejudiced, right? Got to watch how that comes up. So the last thing I would like to add, and I'll stop sharing my screen here and we'll just go to gallery. And I apologize to Dr. Warner for not putting the slide in there, but this talk is a very, very small part of a larger course that will be present in a couple of venues. One of them is the new LLU, or Love and Learn University. It will
Listen and love.
Thank you. Listen and love. Listen is a key part of that. My apologies. I've been calling it Love and Learn for months, so I apologize. Listen and Learn University will have an online, possibly a live component to this. We'll see. We're going to build it out. And one of the things that we're going to try to do is do some micro intervention training. We may end up having a micro intervention certificate at some point. The other is that it will be part of a larger, probably about a 4-day seminar as part of our discovery tours. Ideally, we'll be doing the first one in Iceland, chosen partly for its immense beauty and its fine record on human rights, except that there's immense amount of microaggressions that still occur within their society. There, I will add other, there'd be lots more bells and whistles on it, but that's sort of the nut of microaggressions and microinterventions. Particularly, strongly recommend the book Microinterventions that just came out this year. Its primary author is Dr. Sue, but he's got some other authors along with it that have really built this out quite nicely. And that's all I have for you.